Imagine this. You're wrapped in 20 pounds of fabric, steel hoops press against your thighs, petticoats scratch your knees, and a corset hugs your ribs so tight you can't fully breathe, let alone bend. You're not in a costume drama, you're just trying to survive the day. And now you need to pee. But there's a problem. You're essentially wearing architectural armor. You can't just excuse yourself. You can't even find yourself under the layers. The room is full of polite society gentlemen with monocles, women with fans, and absolutely no tolerance for the bodily realities of being human. They smile, they sip tea, and they have no idea you're engaged in a full-blown internal crisis beneath 5 feet of crinoline. You shift your weight, nothing moves, your bladder makes another urgent plea. The chamber pot. And this is when you realize Victorian women didn't just go to the bathroom. They executed a carefully choreographed survival strategy. So the question is, how did they even do it? Today, we're diving skirts and all into the untold story of bathroom survival beneath the world's most ridiculous fashion. And trust me, it's ingenious, a little horrifying, and completely unforgettable. Before a Victorian woman ever considered breakfast, she suited up for battle. It started with a linen chemise, light, breathable, and the only thing soft that would touch her skin all day. Over that came the corset laced so tightly it could shift internal organs and reshape ribs over time. Breathing optional, posture mandatory. Then came the petticoats, layer after layer, each one adding volume, heat, and weight. But the real showstopper, the crinoline. Imagine a steel cage 6 feet wide strapped to your waist. Now try walking through a doorway, or sitting, or breathing while someone offers you tea and asks about your embroidery. These weren't just clothes. They were moving monuments, architectural declarations of wealth, status, and femininity, a walking sculpture of societal expectations. But underneath all that grandeur was a brutal reality. These dresses were never designed with real-life function in mind, especially not when nature called. The irony. The more put together you looked, the less physical freedom you had. Victorian fashion wasn't just about beauty. It was about control of movement, of breath, of basic needs. And so begins the great question behind the satin and steel. How do you go to the bathroom when your dress won't let you bend? There's a moment when your bladder sends its first polite warning that a modern woman might glance around for a restroom. But for a Victorian woman in full dress, that moment marked the beginning of a mission. Because needing to relieve yourself while wearing a crinoline wasn't just inconvenient, it was theatrical. And in this particular act, the stakes were not just comfort, but dignity, reputation, and social survival. Imagine standing in a grand drawing room surrounded by velvet curtains, flickering gaslight, and stiff-collared men discussing empire and property. You feel the pressure building, but your gown, fortified with steel hoops, satin layers, and embroidered underskirts, turns your body into a fortress. Every eye in the room expects you to remain composed, pleasant, and oblivious to anything so crude as biology. Victorian society demanded silence on all things bodily. Even the word leg was considered too risque to be spoken aloud in mixed company. So how does a woman discreetly excuse herself to manage something far more pressing? First, she'd scan the room for a retiring space, a euphemistic oasis where ladies could go not to use the bathroom, of course, but to refresh. Second, she'd signal her maid or a female companion with a series of prearranged looks or gestures. This was not just etiquette. It was choreography learned and practiced. Once inside the retiring room, the performance became even more precise. Beneath 20 pounds of layered clothing, the body had no easy access. Lifting the skirts was not a one-woman job. It required silent teamwork. The chamber pot would be retrieved from a hidden compartment in a chair or discreet cabinet, and the woman, without removing a single item of clothing, would navigate her body into the correct position, all while maintaining absolute composure. Every movement had to be timed and silent. The swish of fabric, the clink of porcelain, even the shift in weight could give away the act. It was a performance built on balance control and stealth, more spy mission than bathroom break. And it didn't end with the act itself. The chamber pot had to be closed, cleaned, and reconcealed by a maid who knew how to move like a ghost. Then, as if nothing happened, the lady would re-enter the drawing room, her face serene, her hands folded, her secret carried back under layers of lace and steel. It's easy to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but what Victorian women mastered wasn't just endurance, it was elegance under constraint. Their daily lives were defined by systems that made basic needs almost impossible, and yet they found a way to adapt, quietly, gracefully, without complaint. In a world where women weren't even allowed to speak about their own bodies, they became masters of managing them in silence. Because the truth was never just about how they went, it was about making sure no one ever knew they had to. In the Victorian world where elegance was mandatory and modesty was law, women didn't use the bathroom, they performed it. At the center of this quiet ritual was the humble chamber pot. But make no mistake, this was no ordinary household item. It was a marvel of design, precision, and stealth. Unlike the clunky ceramic bowls you might imagine, women's chamber pots were sleek, oval-shaped, and ergonomically curved to fit beneath the layers of skirts and steel without disturbing the architecture of the crinoline. Form followed function, all in total secrecy. A well-bred woman didn't remove her dress. That would have been scandalous, impractical, and nearly impossible. Instead, she relied on what can only be described as bodily geometry. With the help of a maid, or alone if skilled, she would strategically shift her layers just enough to allow the chamber pot to slide into position without revealing a single inch of flesh. No zippers, no buttons, no mess, just movement muscle memory and restraint. The better households hid these pots in elegant furniture, mahogany chairs with removable seats, carved cabinets with false fronts. To the untrained eye, these items were merely decorative. To the Victorian woman, they were her salvation. Because in a world that expected women to be ornamental, even her most human moments had to be artfully engineered. Now picture this: a candlelit ballroom. Crystal chandeliers shimmer overhead. Music swells as couples glide across polished floors, skirts sweeping like waves. Everything is grace, glamour, and poise. But beneath the silks and pearls, behind the delicate fans and polite conversation, there's a hidden network operating like a Formula One pit crew, ready to spring into action the moment a lady needs to handle one of life's most basic needs. Formal events posed a unique challenge. A woman might spend hours in public layered in 30 pounds of fabric, unable to excuse herself without setting off a chain of social signals. And yet somehow, Victorian women pulled it off without anyone noticing. The key. The retiring room. These were private lounges tucked just beyond the main ballroom, lavish yet discreet. Inside, maids waited in silence, trained not just in decorum but in choreography. Their job wasn't just to assist, but to anticipate. When a lady entered, the operation began. Skirts were lifted not all at once, but in layers. One maid held the petticoats, another adjusted the steel hoops of the crinoline. A third ensured the chamber pot was placed perfectly, allowing the woman to relieve herself without undressing, without delay, and most of all, without drawing attention. No one spoke. Eye contact was minimal. Every movement was refined, practiced, and graceful. Within minutes, the woman was reassembled like nothing had happened and returned to the dance floor composed and glowing. What makes this extraordinary isn't just the logistics, it's the psychological skill. These women were trained to be still under pressure, elegant under discomfort, and invisible in vulnerability. They performed bodily maintenance in silence while maintaining the illusion of effortlessness. Because in Victorian high society, to be truly powerful was to be unflappable. And these women, cloaked in lace and steel, were masters of composure even when answering nature's call. Here's a twist most people don't see coming. For much of the Victorian era, women didn't wear underwear, at least not the way we think of it today. That's right. Underneath the corsets, petticoats, and towering crinolines, there was nothing. No briefs, no bloomers, just layers of fabric air and social pressure holding everything in place. Why? Because early Victorian fashion made traditional undergarments wildly impractical. Imagine trying to pull anything down underneath 30 pounds of hoop skirts without undressing completely. The very design of women's clothing made the concept of full coverage underwear not only inconvenient, but virtually impossible. But as you can imagine, this freedom came at a cost. Public wardrobe malfunctions were a constant threat. A strong gust of wind could lift a 6-foot-wide skirt like a parasol turning inside out, leaving not just ankles exposed, but far more than society was willing to forgive. These incidents became common enough that change was inevitable. Enter the split-crotch drawer. It sounds scandalous by modern standards, but for Victorian women, it was a stroke of genius. These undergarments featured 2 separate pant legs connected only at the waistband, with an open center that allowed women to use the bathroom without removing them. Modesty remained intact, but access finally was possible. They weren't lacy, they weren't romantic, they were functional. And like so many things in Victorian life, they lived in the space between secrecy and survival. Of course, no one spoke about them. You wouldn't find a lady bragging about her new pair of split drawers over tea. But among women, knowledge passed quietly, mother to daughter, friend to friend, maid to mistress. And so, even their underwear, or lack thereof, reflected the same balance every Victorian woman had to strike dignity without comfort, modesty without freedom and elegance, despite the odds. Because in this world, underwear wasn't about intimacy, it was about engineering survival beneath the spectacle of femininity. As if navigating chamber pots and crinolines wasn't enough, Victorian women also had to manage their menstrual cycles without the help of modern products, privacy, or open conversation. Menstruation wasn't just inconvenient. It was a silent burden hidden beneath lace and silence. Talking about it publicly, unthinkable. Even among close female friends, menstruation was cloaked in euphemism. Yet every month, Victorian women endured it in full corset, under layers of wool, steel, and silk, and somehow made it look effortless. So how did they manage? The answer was homemade ingenuity. Women used cloth pads, reusable, washable, and carefully concealed. These pads were often made from soft flannel cotton rags, or even natural materials like moss sheep's wool or raw cotton. They were held in place by a system called the T-bandage, a belt-like contraption with cloth ties that wrapped around the hips, anchoring absorbent material in place. There were no adhesives, no disposable anything. And on heavy flow days, women might have to change these pads 12 to 20 times, all while attending social functions, sitting through dinners, and maintaining perfect posture in a bone-tight corset. Privacy was non-existent. Servants, often younger girls, were tasked with laundering the cloths discreetly. Mothers passed down techniques in whispers. Maids became silent allies. Women built entire survival systems that operated in secrecy so their public image remained composed and untouched. And they did it all without bathrooms as we know them. No indoor plumbing, no running water, just planning preparation and unshakable emotional control. It wasn't just about hygiene. It was about discipline under pressure. Victorian women were expected to be graceful at all times. But under the velvet and pearls, they were tacticians, navigating bodily reality in a world that refused to even acknowledge it. They didn't have comfort. They didn't have convenience. What they had was resilience and ritual. And they turned those into armor. When it came to hygiene, Victorian women lived in a paradox. They were expected to look immaculate, smell fresh, and remain composed while wearing dresses that were rarely, if ever, washed. The reality was stunning. Many elaborate gowns, often made of delicate silk, velvet, or lace, weren't cleaned regularly. In fact, some weren't washed at all. The process was too risky, too expensive, and too damaging for the fragile fabrics. So how did women stay clean beneath layers of unwashed clothing? Strategy, layers, and ritual. The first line of defense was the linen chemise, the innermost shift worn directly against the skin. This was the garment that did get washed frequently, sometimes even daily. Its job was to absorb sweat, body oils, and odor, protecting the precious outerwear. On top of that came layers of petticoats and corsets, each acting like insulation between the body and the expensive dress. Then came the powders. Women used powders made of rice starch or even crushed chalk to absorb oils from skin and fabric. Gowns were carefully brushed after each wear to remove dust. Items were aired outside or hung in breezeways to release odors. And perfumes strong and floral played a crucial role in masking anything that might betray reality. But the true key to Victorian hygiene wasn't individual effort, it was labor. Behind every impeccably dressed woman stood an invisible army of laundresses, maids, and seamstresses. They were the ones who scrubbed linen drawers, maintained the corsets, and kept up appearances often with no running water and under punishing conditions. And so cleanliness wasn't about soap and water, it was about layers, timing, and discipline. To stay presentable in a world that offered few sanitary resources, Victorian women became masters of controlled presentation. They understood how to maintain the illusion of freshness, even when everything beneath the surface told a different story. Because in that world, hygiene wasn't physical. It was a performance, and they perfected it. Victorian hygiene didn't stop at corsets and chamber pots. It extended, unfortunately, into the streets. Before modern plumbing, much of urban England operated under a system that was equal parts medieval and terrifying. Waste disposal was literal. If you lived in a multi-story building, you simply emptied your chamber pot out the window. Gravity did the rest. To avoid an unexpected shower of human waste, pedestrians quickly learned to listen for the infamous cry, "Gardez-l'eau," a warped English interpretation of the French "gardez-l'eau," meaning "watch out for the water." When you heard it, you ran, or ducked, or prayed you weren't too late. But the horror doesn't end there. In some cases, chamber pot contents weren't just waste, they were resources. During wartime, particularly in the 19th century, urine was collected by government agents to extract saltpeter, a key ingredient in gunpowder. Your personal contribution could literally help fuel a military campaign. Public sanitation systems were a patchwork of half solutions. There were guardrobes, stone chutes that emptied directly into rivers, moats, or open pits. Public outhouses existed, but were rarely gender-specific or private. And of course, only the wealthy had anything resembling an indoor toilet. Even then, it was often little more than an elegantly disguised box with a pot inside. City streets, especially in crowded industrial areas, ran with a mixture of rainwater, mud, animal droppings, and human refuse. Women had to train themselves to step gracefully, lift their skirts just enough, and walk with calculated precision to avoid disaster, because falling in the street meant more than losing balance. It meant contamination. This was the world Victorian women moved through daily, expected to remain pure, fresh, and untouchable while navigating sidewalks that doubled as sewers. So, the next time you flush a toilet or walk confidently down a clean sidewalk, remember, in the 1800s, it wasn't just about managing your own body. It was about surviving a society where even the sky could betray you. Victorian women were more than passive figures, wrapped in lace and taffeta. Beneath the layers of fabric etiquette and societal expectation, they operated a covert system of knowledge, one built on whispers, glances, and coded survival. They had to. When something as natural as menstruation was considered unspeakable, when the act of urination was a choreographed ordeal, and when even slight discomfort had to be concealed behind a smile, women turned to one another, not in rebellion, but in resourceful collaboration. Mothers quietly passed down techniques to daughters. They taught how to maneuver a chamber pot beneath a crinoline without removing a stitch of clothing. They showed how to time fluid intake to avoid emergencies at public events. They passed on which herbs soothed cramps or helped disguise odor. But these weren't formal lessons. They happened behind closed doors in sewing rooms or during whispered moments before a ball. Then came the maids' unsung masters of logistics. A good lady's maid didn't just help dress a woman, she was a silent strategist. She knew which gown required what kind of undergarment, how long her lady could go without needing to retire, and how to shield her from embarrassment in any scenario. These women developed nonverbal systems of communication, hand signals, to indicate when assistance was needed without drawing attention. In social settings, female friends learned to read each other's discomfort, a certain look across a ballroom, a shift in posture. A fan held a moment too long in front of the face. These were their codes, silent, yet powerful tools for managing bodies in a world that denied they even had them. And still, they maintained elegance. That's the remarkable paradox. While the male world marveled at their grace, few ever realized that grace was built on layers of invisible work, secret systems, and shared struggle. Victorian women didn't just endure discomfort, they built entire underground infrastructures of support around it. Quiet resistance, hidden wisdom, strategic adaptation. And within that silence, they crafted power. Because when the world refuses to acknowledge your basic needs, sometimes your greatest strength is how brilliantly you meet them anyway. For decades, Victorian women lived in architectural prisons of fashion, corseted, padded, and hoop-skirted into silhouettes that pleased society, but punished the body. Yet inside those confines, a quiet revolution stirred. And like all true change, it didn't begin in the streets. It began in discomfort. The shift didn't happen overnight. There was no single march or manifesto. But over time, necessity started to chip away at tradition. Women began to question not just how they dressed, but why? Why should a simple bodily function require a team of assistants? Why should basic comfort be sacrificed for societal approval? The bicycle was one of the first sparks. It offered not just transportation, but freedom. But try riding a penny farthing in a 6-foot-wide hoop skirt. Women responded by trading volume for mobility. Bustles replaced crinolines. Corsets loosened. Fabric softened. Function whispered into fashion's ear. Then came war. When World War I erupted, women stepped into roles once deemed unladylike factory work, nursing labor. The Victorian dress simply couldn't survive the trenches of necessity. It was too heavy, too delicate, too symbolic of a world already cracking under modern pressure. Skirts shortened, underwear evolved, practicality finally had a seat at the table. Public health reform followed. With it came modern plumbing, private bathrooms, and the mass production of hygiene products. What had once been whispered was now gradually accepted. Slowly, the shame around women's bodies began to erode, not entirely, but enough for change to root. By the early 20th century, women were no longer just adapting to the system, they were reshaping it. The descendants of those silent chamber pot ballets were no longer tiptoeing around discomfort. They were designing new rules, new garments, new identities. And yet the ingenuity of their ancestors lingered in every discreet pocket, every sewn-in pad, every whisper that became a voice. Victorian fashion may have faded into museums, but the resourcefulness it bred didn't disappear. It evolved, because every time a woman chooses comfort without apology, autonomy without shame, she continues the quiet rebellion once waged in layers of lace and silence. The revolution wasn't loud, but it lasted. It's easy to look back at Victorian women and marvel at the absurdity of their lives. 20 pounds of steel cages, split-crotch drawers, bathroom rituals that required choreography and code words. But if we stop there, we miss the deeper truth. These women weren't just surviving an era of impractical fashion. They were engineering lives around impossible conditions. In a world that demanded they be ornamental, they became strategists. In a society that denied them voice, they found systems. Beneath the bonnets and bustles was a raw, relentless intelligence that history rarely credits. Because it wasn't just about skirts and chamber pots, it was about control. The real legacy of these women is not how they looked, but how they adapted. They were the architects of grace under constraint, innovators of silent resilience. Their bodies were treated like stage props, but their minds operated like generals planning, anticipating, maneuvering. Not in battlefields, but in drawing rooms, ballrooms, and behind closed doors. Even their silence was strategic. It wasn't surrender, it was survival. They turned embarrassment into elegance, inconvenience into ritual. And from those rituals, they carved out dignity day after day. Their quiet genius laid the groundwork for what came after. Every woman who demanded better, more freedom, more comfort, more respect, stood on the petticoats of those who came before. The evolution of fashion wasn't just aesthetic, it was political, it was personal, and it was paved by women who managed to thrive under the weight, literally, of societal expectation. So the next time you zip up a jacket, step into a bathroom without assistance, or speak openly about your body without shame, remember that ease was earned by women who had none. This isn't just a story about historical inconvenience, it's a monument to ingenuity, to the quiet force of women who redefined power not through rebellion, but through adaptation. And though their names may be forgotten, their solutions live on, stitched into modern life, laced through every liberty we now consider ordinary. That was their legacy, and it remains our inheritance. Change didn't happen overnight. Victorian women endured decades of architectural fashion before a quiet revolution reshaped everything, one hemline, one decision at a time. It began with discomfort turned into defiance and ended in transformation. The first cracks in the corseted facade appeared with practicality. The Industrial Revolution brought movement, new jobs, and growing cities. Suddenly, the idea of wearing a 6-foot-wide cage made of steel hoops while stepping onto a crowded omnibus seemed absurd. Women began to favor narrower skirts, and eventually bustles replaced crinolines. But even bustles were a compromise, not freedom. Then came the bicycle. This seemingly innocent invention ignited a social explosion. For the first time, women needed mobility, actual leg movement. Skirts shortened. Bloomers appeared. The freedom to move became synonymous with the freedom to live, and no steel cage could contain that shift. From there, World War I accelerated everything. With men on the front lines, women entered factories, hospitals, and offices. Corsets cracked under the weight of necessity. Function overtook form. Underwear changed too. Those genius split-crotch drawers gave way to closed designs. Elastic bands replaced linen ties. And once taboo menstruation finally began to be discussed quietly at first, but enough to change product design, hygiene expectations, and public conversation. But the true transformation wasn't just physical, it was mental. Victorian women proved that power could come from adaptation, from subtle resistance disguised as etiquette. Modern women took that blueprint and expanded it, demanding comfort, equality, and voice. Today our bathrooms are private, our clothes breathable, our rituals simple. But that ease is the echo of past tension, a direct inheritance from women who made grace a strategy and survival an art. From crinolines to leggings, from chamber pots to plumbing, from shame to honesty, the evolution of liberation wasn't just a fashion shift. It was the slow, unrelenting rise of the female body reclaiming space. Space to move, space to breathe, space to be. Beneath the satin lace and towering crinolines of the Victorian woman's wardrobe was something far more powerful than fabric innovation. What looks to modern eyes like absurd overdesign was actually a masterclass in discrete engineering, bodily awareness, and problem-solving born from necessity. Think about it. These women were expected to perform the impossible, appear flawless, remain composed, and never let the world see the effort it took to maintain that illusion. So they adapted. Not loudly, not rebelliously, but with clever strategic solutions that turned burdens into system solutions that were quietly. The split-crotch drawers weren't just about bathroom convenience. They were about agency, giving women control in a world where control was denied. The chamber pot chairs, the hidden commodes, the linen cloths that doubled as reusable hygiene tools, these weren't primitive. They were personalized tech before the word tech existed. Even more fascinating was the communal intelligence behind these systems. Mothers taught daughters how to navigate layers of fashion, like generals preparing soldiers for war. Maids became quiet tacticians, reading subtle cues and providing help in moments that demanded silence. and female friends formed hidden alliances, signaling needs through fan flicks or whispered code. This was a society where public modesty reigned, yet the private sphere was a hive of female knowledge sharing. It's no exaggeration to say Victorian women operated like secret societies of survival, each solution whispered through generations, passed like heirlooms. And here's the twist: many of these archaic systems directly shaped modern comforts. From the evolution of underwear and menstrual hygiene to the concept of private powder rooms and discreet product design. What we take for granted was carved out one layer at a time by women in corsets who refused to be defeated by design. So the next time we zip a hoodie, flush a toilet, or reach for a sanitary product in a store aisle, we might remember the ones who did it first, quietly, brilliantly, and under 20 pounds of velvet and steel, because they weren't just surviving fashion, they were outsmarting it. We often romanticize the past, draping it in lace and nostalgia. But beneath the beauty of Victorian gowns was a reality stitched with discomfort, ingenuity, and silent strength. These women didn't just endure the absurd, they engineered grace within it. They turned chamber pots into strategy corsets, into discipline and silence into survival. Their story reminds us that dignity isn't always loud. Sometimes it's hidden beneath 20 pounds of fabric and held together by sheer will. If this glimpse into the secret lives of Victorian women moved, you drop a comment below. What surprised you most? And don't forget to subscribe. Because history isn't just about kings and wars. Sometimes it's about the quiet power of a woman who simply had to pee.